At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches Episode 4. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 11 Josh September 6, 1946 After school Olivia. He whispered, his own palm throbbing. You have it too. Olivia looked up at him in confusion. She stared deeply into Josh's emerald eyes, and then the realization struck her. Her chocolate brown eyes widened and she clutched Josh's warm hands tightly. Josh, she quietly gasped. Do you mean? Josh bit his lip, his heart racing and his nerves pulsing with anxiousness. All the frustration and impatience he was feeling prior to instantly left his mind. The realization that both he and his girlfriend had the same mark on their hands scared Josh, and he didn't care about being late to football practice anymore. Although the fact that there was someone else who had this mark imprinted on their hand beside him made him sigh with relief. It also made him ponder more deeply about the symbol embedded in his hand because before this Josh simply dismissed it. He suddenly wanted answers, and to comfort the terrified Olivia that stood in front of him. Josh inhaled deeply and lifted his right palm for Olivia to see. Olivia gasped, her brown eyes glimmering with shock. I can't believe it. So there are more people who have it, she said in a soft and quiet voice. Josh couldn't remember a time when she said anything with a tone like that before. Josh, there's more I need to tell you, she added, taking her gaze off his hand and looking at him straight in the eye. What else do you know about it? He replied, nodding his head with extreme desperation for any vital information. Olivia quietly gulped before speaking, her knees wobbling as she tried to muster the courage to talk about something as scary and real as this. Josh placed his warm hands on Olivia's shoulder and steadied her. Olivia looked up at him and he gave her a nod, assuring her that he was there with her. It's not only me and you, Josh, she hesitantly started, while clasping her trembling hands together. Josh leaned towards Olivia, begging her to continue as his curiosity took over him. Jessica too. Plus some other kid from our homeroom class, Carter. Yuta knows about it too, although he doesn't have the mark. Josh looked at Olivia with an appalled expression. Jessica. He gasped, feeling pity for his friend. He wondered how she got the mark in the first place. The same question went for him and Olivia. But who the hell are Yuta and Carter? The transfer student from Japan and his friend, the one with the white hair, Olivia answered. Josh gaped, understanding who she meant. He suddenly remembered who Olivia was talking about. The new kid that broke 3 of Olivia's rules in one sitting, and the one white-haired nerd that sat in the corner of the class. Josh furrowed his eyebrows, questions upon questions running through his mind. Adrenaline pumped through his blood as he sorted all the information he had in his mind, trying to make sense of the situation. You said that the mark appeared after that mysterious shadow strangled you. Josh questioned Olivia. Olivia nodded her head. Why, yes. It was the same with Jessica and Carter. They experienced some mysterious thing and then the same mark appeared in the same spot, on our right palm, Olivia explained, trying to relay the information as fast as possible. Josh widened his eyes in bewilderment. What mysterious thing are you talking about? And how did you know about the others' marks in the first place? Josh frantically questioned, his body shaking. Josh bit his lip and inhaled deeply, trying to control his nerves. Olivia, I know this must be frightening you right now, but that's only because this is real, Josh said, gripping Olivia's shoulders tightly. I need you to tell me everything. I've been confused for a couple of days about this stupid symbol that appeared on my hand, and I want to know whether this is something we should be worried about. Olivia nodded her head, understanding. Natch, I'll explain everything. I forgot how, but somehow Jessica and I started talking to Yuta and Carter about something. Then Yuta noticed the mark on my hand, and he said he recognized it because his friend Carter told him about it. That's when we realized Jessica had the same exact mark. So later, we discussed it together and theorized that perhaps the marks appeared on our hands after we experienced that thing. Olivia quickly explained to Josh. Or maybe it could have something to do with the numbers written below the symbol, 9346, which translates to September 3, 1946. That was the first day of school, Josh. Olivia added, her wide brown eyes looking up at him with horror. What thing? Do you mean that shadow that strangled you? Josh asked, his brown eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Yes, although only for me. The others experienced something different. Jessica said she saw some demon zombie approach her. Carter said his hand was stuck to the doorknob one time, and then the second time he drowned because a similar shadow to mine sunk him, Olivia explained, trying to form as many coherent sentences as possible. Hearing it being spoken out loud made Josh realize how crazy she sounded. But there was this gut feeling that told him it must be real since he experienced it himself. Josh's desperation and curiosity abruptly halted. His hand stopped shaking as he realized that something similar yet different occurred to him before the mark appeared on his hand. Olivia, he whispered as the color in his eyes drained. Olivia placed her hands on Josh's cheeks. Is everything all right, Josh? Do you know something? She asked, searching his eyes for an answer. Josh didn't respond. Instead, he was staring off into the distance, a wistful expression written on his face. The students around them had left a long time ago. Around the moment Olivia started talking to Josh. Josh recently realized how quiet the halls of Willesden was, with or without students. The corridors were always gray and dark, and the steel floor creaked every time somebody jumped or placed too much pressure against it. Josh gazed at his surroundings, wondering why he noticed this now. Compared to the discussion Olivia and Josh were currently having, the hallways of Willesden should be the least of his worries. Although it wasn't just the corridors, Josh realized. It was the somber classrooms too. It was the cramped gymnasium, the football field that stretched across the vast land behind Willesden, the rusty basketball court, the murky swimming pool, the haunting washrooms, the grim library, the sinister school entrance, the bleak exterior of the building, the shabby houses surrounding the school, and the entire dreary town of Willesden itself. Although Willesden was a small town and everyone knew each other, it always felt strangely ample to Josh. It was so limitless that it felt like there was always something unknown hiding in the bushes. Josh glanced over to the classroom that was across the hall from where he and Olivia were standing. The lights of the room were closed, but the door remained slightly open. Fear pulsed through Josh's veins as a strange feeling entered him. Why does it look like someone is watching? Josh, Olivia shouted, slapping Josh on the cheek and pulling him out of his ominous trance. Josh gasped and looked down at Olivia, his entire body quivering with shock. Is everything all right? What happened to you suddenly? She asked, softly rubbing the spot on his red cheek where she hit. Josh gulped and glanced at the classroom door again. A perilous emotion entered his soul. Olivia, let's talk outside, he proclaimed, grabbing his girlfriend's hand and quickly dragging her out of the building. What about football practice? Olivia asked, trying to keep up with Josh's long and fast strides. Football can wait, Josh declared as his eyes narrowed. As soon as they arrived outside, they both sat on the wooden bench that was placed in front of the school entrance. The sky was dreary and gray like usual, although it was a lot brighter than it was inside the building. There was a moment of silence between the two as their eyes adjusted to the sudden light. Afterwards, Josh turned to look at Olivia and placed a hand on her shoulder. Olivia, you were saying how some peculiar thing occurred before the mark appeared on everyone's hand, right? Josh confirmed. Olivia swiftly nodded her head in response. Josh quietly gulped. Well, something like that happened to me. Olivia softly gasped. Really, you too? She exclaimed, a hand over her mouth. I think I understand what happened, he began after taking a deep breath. In the middle of football practice a couple of days ago, Ronald chucked a ball straight at my head. Suddenly, I was hanging upside down in the air, and my body couldn't move at all. There was a blinding light, so I couldn't see my surroundings. After a couple of minutes, I woke up, lying down on the field. Nobody else experienced what I did, and they all thought I was unconscious because the ball hit my head. I thought so too, but then I noticed the symbol appear on my hand after that moment, Josh explained. Although, the weird thing about it is that I don't remember a ball coming at me before I experienced the thing. So, as much as it pains me to admit, I don't think what I experienced was a result of Ronald chucking the ball at my head. Then what is it? Why did this happen to us? Olivia inquired, placing a comforting hand on Josh's trembling thigh. Josh inhaled deeply before replying with his hypothesis on the situation. I'm quite sure what's happening to us isn't simply some shared ridiculous delusion. It is paranormal activity. Olivia furrowed her eyebrows in confusion. Huh? Olivia gasped in disbelief. You can't be serious. Why, do you truly think that could be it? Josh bit his lip and nodded his head, turning to look Olivia straight in her eye. Olivia, this is serious. Bring Jessica and the other 2 people involved in this to me. We need to have a talk because I have some theories, Josh instructed, nodding his head alongside Olivia to make sure she understood. Olivia stared at Josh with dismay. How am I going to gather all of them? She complained. I am not going to give up my pride just so we can all meet up to talk and pretend we're friends, Olivia declared arrogantly, shaking her head at Josh. Please, Olivia, Josh pleaded. I need to know what happened to them in detail. And I believe everyone involved in this deserves to be given at least some idea of what might possibly be going on. I want to tell everyone what I think at the same time. Olivia sighed and slowly nodded her head, her body feeling drowsy and heavy from all the revelations that occurred today. Although Josh felt entirely different. Adrenaline pumped through his body and his eyes blinked rapidly with excitement. For the first time in a while, Josh felt truly committed to something. He truly wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery, even if it meant sacrificing a couple of football practices. Josh was never like this. He was always dead set on football, and his life revolved around football only. Sometimes he couldn't even spend time with his girlfriend, since his mothers were pushing him to practice every day. However, for some reason, talking to Olivia about this new situation liberated Josh. He could only imagine how enlightening and refreshing it would feel once they solved the mystery. I'm home, Josh yelled as he stepped inside his rundown house. His house was the kind that made him hesitant to even step through the doorway. He knew that after his 3rd step the wooden floor would creak, in a way that would make him feel like the house was going to crumble if he stepped any further. He stepped through anyway, ignoring the stupid creaking. He had passed this entrance many times before, so he knew that his 1-story house wasn't collapsing anytime soon. Josh quickly untied the shoelaces of his dirty sneakers and slid them off. Josh tossed his rugged backpack to the side and walked into the cramped kitchen, which wasn't too many steps away from the entrance. He placed his quivering hands inside his varsity jacket pockets and greeted his mother. His mother looked over her shoulder and placed the wooden spoon that was in her hand inside the mixing bowl. She gave him a weary smile, her emerald eyes staring at him dimly and her withering brunette hair flowing past her shoulders in an untied mess. How was school, Josh? She asked, her ivory skin appearing translucent beneath the flickering lights of their kitchen. Josh shrugged, his hands still clenched around the insides of his jacket pockets. It was all right, Judith, he replied nonchalantly, biting the insides of his cheek to stop himself from forming an elated grin. If Josh showed a hint of excitement about something other than football, he knew his mothers would interrogate him deeply about it, and then repeat the same sentence Josh was too familiar with. Well, I hope your focus is mainly football, Josh. You know we need that scholarship. Judith returned to mixing the batter in her bowl. Did football practice go well? She questioned in a disciplinary voice that pierced Josh's heart every time she asked. Josh hesitated before responding. He hated lying to his mother, but he did it so often that the guilt he felt quickly disintegrated after a couple of minutes. It went well, he flatly replied, giving the response his mother wanted to hear. He could only imagine her reaction if Josh had told her the truth about him skipping football practice for the first time. A shiver went up his spine at the mere thought of it. He was already prepared for Coach McGurdy's scolding that was bound to arrive tomorrow, but was never prepared for his mother's scolding. Excellent. Susan is waiting for you in the backyard to start your after-school training, Judith stated in a subdued tone, although with an underlying stern intention that only Josh could catch on to. She continued stirring the batter, not taking her eyes off the bowl. Remember, Josh, the announcement for who gets the football scholarship is going to occur at the end of this month. So work hard and cook the gas. Josh nodded his head, although Judith's back was facing him so she couldn't see it. May I please have a snack first? That pastry you're baking looks delicious, Josh asked with a light-hearted voice, licking his lips as he peered over his mother's shoulder to get a better glance at the pastry she was making. No, Josh. You know as well as I do that eating before exercising is bad for your progress, she cut in strictly. Josh bit his lip as he looked down at his feet and nodded his drooping head. I'm making protein-fueled biscuits, by the way. You can have some after your training, Judith remarked. Okay, Josh complied, knitting his brows. I'm going to start training now. Josh swiftly jogged towards his small bedroom that was across the kitchen. He passed by one cracked window that was near his parents' shared bedroom. The moldy wooden walls with water stains splashed upon it followed Josh as he rushed by them. Slivers of light shone from the cracked window as if invited in to ignite these dusty hues. Josh closed the door of his small bedroom and changed into his workout clothes. His bedroom looked identical to the rest of the one-floor house, which was quaint in size, aging and broken. A small bed, fitted for a kid, sat at one end, with a broken night table plopped next to it. Josh could barely fit on the bed anymore, so he laid his blanket on the floor next to it and slept there at night. The floorboards were caved and broken, leaving the two simple pieces of furniture sloped towards the dirt, waiting for them. Josh finished changing clothes and unlocked his door. Then he walked towards the back of the house and stepped outside. His second mother, Susan, was waiting for him in the tiny fenced backyard of their house. Her raven black hair was tied in a high ponytail, and it swished from side to side as she waved at her son. She was wearing a gray vest and black track pants, and a silver whistle was wrapped around her neck. Her black eyes pierced into his soul as Josh approached her, while her hawk-like nose sneered down at him. "Did you do well today during football?" Susan asked in a rigid tone, as she handed Josh a water bottle. Josh nodded his head and began stretching with his mother. "It went swell," he repeated dryly. The excitement he was feeling earlier disappeared as soon as he began talking to his parents. If someone had told Josh yesterday that he was going to skip practice today, Josh would have called them insane. He quietly sighed to himself, realizing he could never escape his fate of football. Josh bit his lip as he remembered how quickly he latched onto the idea of a new adventure in his life. Thinking back on it now, it was shocking to Josh how he accepted the fact that paranormal activity might be occurring to his friends in a heartbeat. It was as if he was desperate for something new in his life. Susan clicked her tongue sharply, interrupting Josh's thoughts and returning him to reality. "So, how's your girlfriend?" Susan inquired firmly, attempting to fill in the silence that was between them as they exercised together. Josh gave his mother a forced smile. "She's doing well. Spiffy as usual," he responded grimly, panting in between reps. Susan nodded her head, the tough expression on her face never budging, no matter the topic. After a couple more drills, Susan allowed Josh to have a quick 5-minute break. Josh gasped for air as he laid down on the dry grass of their backyard and stared up at the slowly darkening evening sky. "Josh," Susan snapped, kicking Josh's side with her foot and hitting his rib. Josh jolted up, already knowing what she was going to say. "Don't lie down after exercising, idiot. How many times do I have to tell you this?" she yelled harshly, her bony hands resting on her hips. Josh gulped and gave his mother an apologetic expression. "I deeply apologize, Susan," he said guiltily, looking straight into his mother's icy eyes. Susan didn't respond. She just sighed disconsolately as she bent down to pick up her water bottle. After she took a big gulp, she looked at Josh. "You think you're going to get that scholarship?" she suddenly asked, her eyes scanning him sternly. "Of course. I'm the captain of the team," Josh confidently responded, without hesitation. His arms rested by his sides, like a stiff and obedient soldier. He straightened his back before answering, wanting to demonstrate to his mother that he truly was capable. Susan nodded her head and patted the boy's back. "That's what I like to hear. Now let's jog around the neighborhood." 3 laps, she commanded, blowing her whistle to signal the end of their break. As they jogged, Josh came to a sudden conclusion. He decided he wouldn't skip any more practices for fear of disappointing his parents. However, he would spend time focusing on the current mystery at school. It was going to be difficult balancing both tasks, but he had no choice. 1. 12 Ronald. September 7, 1946 Homeroom. Ronald walked into his homeroom class alongside some of his friends from football. He laughed and talked with his folks for a couple of minutes, until he noticed Jessica standing solemnly by his desk, waiting for him. Confused, Ronald walked up to his friend and tapped her shoulder. "Something wrong, Jess?" Ronald asked her, peering into her deep blue eyes. I meant Jessica," he quickly added, noticing the dark glint in her eyes. Jessica let out an exasperated sigh. "Ronald, remember when I told you about that symbol on my hand?" she asked, tilting her head up to look at Ronald. Ronald quickly nodded his head, interrupting Jessica from saying anything further. Yes, Jessica. Actually, about that. There's something I need to tell you, Ronald said hurriedly. He had desperately wanted to tell Jessica about the symbol that appeared on his hand, which had strangely occurred a couple of hours after Jessica confided in him, a few days ago. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Really? I have something to tell you about it too, she said, a look of puzzlement appearing on her face. She leaned in, suddenly interested in what he had to say. Ronald waited for her to continue after that, but she didn't. There was a moment of awkward silence between the two as he realized she was waiting for him. Flustered, Ronald nodded his head and began. Well, after you told me about what happened to you, I went home. Strangely enough, my head started aching immensely. Then I glanced at my hands and saw the symbol, which I swear wasn't there before. Ronald quickly explained, deciding to omit the part about the weird flashbacks he had been having prior, for fear of looking like a coward in front of Jessica. Jessica gasped. You two? Really? She suddenly shouted, and the chattering students around them paused their conversations and stared at Jessica. Ronald was taken aback by Jessica's loud tone. She was usually soft-spoken and kept to herself most of the time, so he was slightly shocked when she jumped up like that. Ronald formed a tiny grin. That was cute. She can be quite a cookie at times. Jessica noticed the grin and rolled her eyes. Ronald, this isn't gas. Quit laughing, this is serious. She whispered, loud enough for Ronald to hear but too quiet for those around them to hear. Aren't you worried? Aren't you scared? An unknown thing appeared on your hand out of nowhere. You should at least look concerned, Jessica huffed, stepping on Ronald's boot with her sharp pink heels. Ouch. What was that for? He shouted, the sudden jolt awakening him from the unbroken gawking at Jessica. And for what reason are your stompers so sharp for? I was going to tell you that we're not the only ones. Jessica hissed, her diamond blue eyes looking up at him with seriousness. The pain in his foot instantly disappeared at the mention of this new information. Ronald gave Jessica a bewildered look. What do you mean? He frantically asked, his interest in the conversation surging once more. Jessica glanced over her shoulder and around the classroom, then she stepped towards Ronald, ensuring no one was able to hear them. As she stood closer to him, Ronald could smell the rose perfume she wore, its scent wafting up to his nose like an addictive drug. Olivia has it too. So does Carter, some other lad in this homeroom class, Jessica whispered, pointing towards where Olivia sat. Olivia has it too. Ronald gasped, shocked at the sudden boatloads of information he was receiving. Ronald glanced over his shoulder and looked towards where Olivia sat, talking to her boyfriend Josh. They seemed to be engaging in a serious conversation because, for the first time, their lips weren't all over each other. A little bit of jealousy glinted in Ronald's deep brown eyes, as he watched Josh grab Olivia's hands reassuringly. Who is this Carter lad? Ronald asked, wanting Jessica to give him every bit of information she can. Jessica pointed to an empty desk on the other side of the classroom, in the corner next to the cracked window. He sits over there. I'll point him out to you when he arrives, Jessica replied, and Ronald nodded his head. By the way, there are some people who know about this but don't have the symbol. Yuta, Carter's friend who sits next to him over there. And Josh, since I'm quite sure Olivia told him about the entire situation by now. She was the one who told me to tell you. To be frank, I'm glad, or else I would have never found out that you have this mark too, Jessica added. Ronald's eyes widened at the mention of Josh. He's in on this too. You've got to be kidding me, Ronald sighed, placing his palm on his forehead. Jessica shrugged, knowing of his and Josh's rivalry. Put your personal grudges aside. We have to work together in order to solve this mystery, Jessica pointed out. I still have to talk to Olivia and ask her if she got any new information from Josh. Most likely not, though. She's such a fat head, Jessica sighed, crossing her arms. Ronald was about to ask Jessica why she called her best friend that, but before he could, Jessica gasped and pointed towards the door. That's Yuta and Carter, look. Jessica exclaimed, pointing towards the two boys. Ronald noticed that her sad eyes had suddenly lit up. Yuta is the one with black hair and Carter is the one with the white hair, she quickly explained, eagerly dragging Ronald to the door by his arm. Okay. Ronald hesitantly complied, as they rushed towards the classroom door. Yuta. Hi-de-ho. Jessica waved, a giddy smile on her face. This sudden shift in Jessica's character confused Ronald, but he decided to go along with it and not question her about it. They stopped the two boys in the middle of the doorway, but that didn't seem to bother anyone. The boy named Yuta grinned at Jessica as he swiped his black bangs off his forehead, revealing his narrow black eyes. His eyes matched the way Ronald assumed he felt towards the world, dark and cold. The whites of his eyes contrasted sharply with the pitch-black iris that sunk deep into his head. Its depth resembled that of a black hole in space, an air of eeriness and unsettling coldness emanating from his gaze. Ronald peered into them suspiciously as Jessica and Yuta talked. He looks like the boy version of a witch, Ronald thought, a strange expression appearing on his face. Strange. What are you looking at? A stern voice asked Ronald. Ronald's eyes switched over to the white-haired boy standing next to Yuta, his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. He must be Carter. Ronald shrugged. Nothing, he simply replied. Jessica cut in their conversation, unknowingly saving Ronald from the embarrassment of explaining himself. Yuta Carter. This is Ronald, my boyfriend, she feebly introduced, gesturing towards Ronald. Ronald could tell she really hated saying that out loud. Ronald waved, accidentally showing his right palm in the process. Yuta and Carter quickly lunged forward and grabbed Ronald's hands. Oh my! Yuta exclaimed, giving Ronald a surprised look. You two? He asked, although the answer to that question was obvious. Ronald nodded his head. Yeah, I just found out today. Olivia told me to tell Ronald about the situation, and she probably told Josh already, Jessica explained, twirling her ponytail in her hand. Carter groaned. What did I tell you to? He growled, his silver eyes narrowing with frustration. Jessica placed her hands on her hips. Hey, it turned out Ronald has it too, so it's actually beneficial, Jessica replied in a sassy tone, which was entirely different from the one she used with Ronald. Yuta too, for that matter. Carter sighed, letting go of Ronald's hand. True. But what about Josh? Why did you have to tell him? We don't know whether he has it or not. Carter retorted. Ronald nodded his head in agreement. I'm with you on that one, Ronald scoffed to himself, completely hating the idea that Josh is a part of this. This remark caused Carter to notice Ronald again, and he looked up at him. How much do you know? Carter suddenly inquired. His eyebrows arched. Ronald shrugged. The only thing Jessica told me was the fact that there are others who have this mark, Ronald responded, shoving his hands in the pockets of his trousers. Ronald had to admit, he was quite unfazed about the entire situation. True, when the mark first appeared, Ronald was frightened and curious, however. The next day it completely slipped from his mind. He even forgot to update Jessica on the situation and tell her that he genuinely believes her. So, when Jessica approached him today, he suddenly remembered and was interested in understanding what the weird flashbacks he had that day were. However, after meeting these two boys, that curiosity strangely died down. Ronald wondered what the point of all this was. It only happened to him once, and it was likely just a dream. Plus, all he felt like doing was throwing a football around, beating Josh, and getting that scholarship. Carter huffed. True, that's the only fact we know. Although there's more than that. We're going to have to fill you in, Carter stated, resting his palm on his chin. Although we need to do it in private. Where? I have like the perfect solution for that problem, a high-pitched voice cut in from behind Ronald. The group turned around and they simultaneously groaned at the sight of Olivia. Except for Ronald, since he silently groaned at the sight of Josh standing next to her. Josh had the same feeling. He approached Ronald with a scowl on his face and an intimidating aura surrounding him. What the hell is he doing here? Josh asked everyone but Ronald, his voice gruff and angry. I was about to ask you the same question, Ronald retorted, crossing his arms and facing Josh straight in the eyes. He decided a couple of days ago that he was not going to play nice with Josh anymore, since Josh was never decent to him. I was also about to ask you, where were you yesterday? You missed football practice, so McGurdy put me in charge. He noticed Josh glower as his green eyes flashed with anger, and it was exactly what Ronald wanted to see. He knew Josh would immediately hate the fact that Ronald was in charge of the practice. There. A taste of one's own medicine. Oh, and by the way, McGurdy told me to mention to you that if you decide to come to practice today, you're running laps the entire time, Ronald blatantly added, a smirk present on his face. Josh faltered. How am I going to perform my captain duties if I'm running the entire time? Josh furiously questioned through gritted teeth. Although it was a rhetorical question as it wasn't hard to come up with the answer. Ronald shrugged, haughtily sneering at him. One should have asked themselves that yesterday, Ronald slyly replied. Before Josh could respond further, Olivia interrupted. Boys, why calm down? There are, more important matters at stake here, Olivia declared, stepping in between the boys and wrapping her hand around Josh's arm. Jessica scoffed from behind Ronald. You're one to talk, she quietly murmured to herself. Carter circled around the group, dragging Yuta along with him. He positioned himself in a spot where everybody could see each other and no one was blocking the other. I think I understand the situation here. We need to sort things out between each other before we act together, Carter suggested. Although he made it sound like a command. Everyone silently stared at Carter, disliking his brainchild already. Beside him, Yuta shuffled his feet uncomfortably and darted his eyes nervously around the group. Ronald couldn't help but get the sense that he was hiding something. Olivia clicked her tongue, breaking the silence. I don't know about you folks, but why I have a better brainchild than that, Olivia said, flipping her bouncy chocolate brown hair over her shoulder. Let's all meet up here after school. Why, what we need to do is sort things out about the thing. Everyone nodded their head in agreement. It was my brainchild, though, Josh interjected arrogantly. I was the one who ordered Olivia to gather all of us together, Josh added, looking around at the awkwardly silent group. Ronald rolled his eyes, taking the credit as always. Olivia looked at Josh and clutched his hand. It was our brainchild. They both smiled at each other, although Ronald could have sworn he saw a tiny hint of distaste in Josh's green eyes as he looked at Olivia. Why? What's with this big group? A voice piped up from behind them. You kids are blocking the doorway. The group turned around and saw that it was Mr. Stevenson who was popping his head from behind the door. We're so sorry, Mr. Stevenson, Yuta moderately exclaimed. Ronald noticed that it was the first time he spoke up during this confrontation. Perhaps he's shy. Mr. Stevenson scanned the group with a shiny glint in his eyes and a kind smile spreading across his face. Don't worry about it, folks. However, I'm about to start class, so get to your seats. You kids can chat all you want after school. Ronald eagerly awaited football practice today. He was excited to witness Josh live a day in his shoes, and be the second most important person on the field for once. Once class was over, Ronald rushed towards the locker room, and hastily changed into his gym uniform. Then he exited the room and approached Coach McGurty, who was standing outside the locker room, waiting for the boys to finish changing so they could start practice. Coach, Ronald called to her, with an ecstatic smile on his face. McGurty turned around to face Ronald, her stoic expression unchanging. Her light brown hair was tied in a ponytail and her arms were crossed in a boorish stance. Ronald, she grunted, looking up at the tall boy with her icy gaze. It was difficult for Ronald to tell whether she meant well or not. You're the first one out, she stated, referring to the fact that Ronald was the first person to leave the locker room. Ronald nodded his head, giving his coach a polite smile. Yes, coach. That's because I wanted to quickly ask you, what will I be doing today? He inquired, in a seemingly innocent tone but with arrogant intentions underneath. Truthfully, the reason why Ronald was quick to change today was that he wanted to speak with McGurty before Josh could catch up to her and bribe her using his charms to make him not run laps. Coach McGurty scoffed. You think you're going to be team captain again because Josh is running laps today, she commented with a taunting grin. The grin looked unnatural on the tough woman's face, causing Ronald to reflectively wince at the sudden reaction. He was unsure what that grin meant, which was a typical theme with McGurty. Ronald decided to be honest. There really was no other option with McGurty, as she would always find out the truth anyway. Yes, coach, he responded sheepishly. I simply want to confirm with you, he explained, shrugging. McGurty's customary frown flipped again and cracked into a wide smile. It shocked Ronald, although he wasn't sure he could describe it as a smile. The left side of her faint red lip tugged upwards, creating a sinister smirk. However, what she said next jarred Ronald even more. No. Josh is going to be resuming his captain duties today, she announced sternly. Ronald stared at McGurty with an appalled expression, his mouth hanging open. He was not expecting that response. I told you yesterday not to get arrogant, remember? She began, her brash voice suddenly irritating Ronald. Of course, I'm extremely furious with Josh. He's staying back for extra time after practice to do those laps. However, I realized yesterday that he is a much better leader than you are, she curtly remarked. There was a moment of silence between the two, as Ronald waited for a clearer explanation. It never came. That's it. He wavered in a quiet and defeated voice. Betrayal crept under his skin, slithering and itching in places he couldn't reach. He tried to stretch out and grab the hope at the end of the darkly lit tunnel, the hope that this was simply a joke, but to no avail. His admiration for McGurdy quickly turned to hate. It was as if he didn't even fight it. He allowed that negative emotion to swallow him and convert into acid in his soul. McGurdy sneered at Ronald, a Cheshire grin plastered on her face. What? You thought that you would be the captain again today? I never said that yesterday. McGurdy paused to snort, a bitter laugh escaping her mouth. The laugh came from her like a newly sprung leak, timid at first, stopping and starting. Soon, it accelerated into something deeper and sinister. She wasn't done yet, though. Ronald could tell from the way she rolled her hazel eyes to the sky and bit her lip. From deep inside her chest came a great shaking motion and her face muscles grew tight. There was no remorse or pity in her eyes whatsoever, but Ronald expected that. After heavily panting for a couple of minutes, she sighed and looked at Ronald. Now, since that's done and dealt with, pick up the equipment and get on the field, she barked, pointing at the neon orange pylons scattered on the ground around them. Ronald hesitantly bent down to pick the equipment on the ground. As Ronald did this while McGurdy gazed scornfully down at him, he heard slow footsteps approach from behind him. Ronald kept his raging eyes on the ground, not caring who it was and not wanting to show his face. The footsteps circled around Ronald and stopped in front of Coach McGurdy. Hey, Coach. Ronald heard a familiar yet unfriendly voice say. Ronald could recognize that irritating voice anywhere since the fake cheerfulness that emitted from it always sent shivers down Ronald's spine. Josh, McGurdy replied nonchalantly. Ronald looked up and saw the two of them greeting each other, both with pompous and smug expressions on their faces. Josh tilted his head and looked down at Ronald, his venomous green eyes peering down at Ronald like a looming serpent. Thanks for allowing me to join practice today, Coach, Josh said darkly, still staring at his baffled teammate below him. His lips twitched into a smirk, giving Ronald all the hints he needed to fit the pieces of the puzzle. Josh had gotten to McGurdy before Ronald. Second place like always, Josh's sinister expression seemed to say. 113 Utah. September 7, 1946. After school, their first meeting was 1 hour after school. This 1 hour wait was since Josh, Ronald, Carter, and Utah had to go to their respective club activities. Once their swim practice of the day was over, Utah and Carter rushed to room 110, where Mr. Stevenson's homeroom is located. The group decided to gather there upon Olivia's suggestion since it was the only class the six of them were all in together. As the boys walked through the halls to get to room 110, Carter listed all the topics that needed to be discussed. First, we need to fill Ronald in on all the details. Then we need to confirm with everyone that we're all on the same page. Next, we need to discuss and theorize all the logical possibilities and reasons as to why this is happening, Carter stated, holding up 3 fingers. Utah exhaled, his head aching and a look of grimace appearing on his face. You talk a lot, Carter, he abruptly remarked, walking past him. Carter looked at his friend who sped in front of him, with a hurt and taken aback expression. He stayed quiet for the rest of the journey down the hall, doubtful thoughts entering his mind. Utah didn't realize that his blunt words hurt the very first friend he made at Willesden. His head was heavy with more drastic topics, and he couldn't seem to shake them off no matter how hard he tried. It was gnawing at him and eating him whole, resulting in him acting more irritated than before. It was very dark in Utah's mind. The new town he was in no longer seemed magical. The gray skies no longer seemed limitless. Tears were brimming in his eyes, wanting to roll down, but they were too stubborn. However, he was glad that he got to stay after school for an extra hour. He didn't want to go home. He didn't know who to tell. Maybe Carter, but would he even understand? Or possibly Jessica, but he didn't want to burden the poor girl with his problems since she seemed to have a lot herself. There was no way he could confide to his parents since they were the cause of this pain. Finally, they arrived at their homeroom classroom. Yuta gazed around the darkly lit room and saw Olivia sitting in the middle with her legs crossed, Jessica standing next to her with her arms hugging her chest, and Ronald leaning against the wall on the other side. They all had a deadpan expression on their face, appearing as if they wanted to be anywhere but here. Suspense filled the air in the room, and an aura of awkwardness surrounded them. Yuta traveled his hands around the wall beside him, searching for the light switch. Once he found it, he flicked it but none of the lights turned on. Strange, Yuta thought, realizing that the lights were never really turned on during the school day. Where's Josh? Yuta hesitantly asked as he and Carter approached the group. They all stood around a couple of desks pushed together to form a bigger table, in the middle of the classroom. The evening sun was setting behind them and only a few rays peered through the classroom window, giving off enough light so that they could see each other's illuminated faces. Ronald spoke first. He's going to come late. The bastard has to run laps for an extra hour. Ronald huffed, visible irritation appearing on his face as if something was bothering him. He deserves it, he added, mumbling. Yuta nodded his head as Carter gruffly walked past him and approached the table. He slid his backpack off his shoulders and threw it on the table that landed with a smash. As he loudly rummaged through his bag, Yuta turned to talk to Jessica. Hey Jess, he waved as the girl smiled up at him. Yuta. She giggled, inching closer towards the boy. She flipped her luscious blonde hair over her shoulder and looked up at the taller boy. I've been thinking about all this. And it's just crazy, you know? She began, shaking her head as her pink lips shifted into a beautiful grin. Yuta light-heartedly chuckled in response. He enjoyed talking to Jessica. She was easy to speak to and he felt comfortable around her. It didn't feel like anything was forced, which was something he previously expected from her since she is a part of Olivia's squad. Their relationship was similar to how Yuta felt about Carter. The two began hanging out after classes since the first revelation, and it has been some of the best moments of his school life. It took Carter a while to get used to Jessica, and they still argued now and then, but to Yuta it was hilarious. It was an entirely different experience from the one he had at his old school. Plus, seeing Jessica smile warmed his heart, especially given the fact that her blue eyes used to be filled with despair. Although it was odd, the fact that Jessica is a completely different person around Yuta than she was with Olivia. Yuta didn't know Jessica personally yet, but he intended to dig deeper than the facade she has on the surface. Thinking about other people's problems such as Jessica and the whole hallucination thing truly averted Yuta's mind from his dilemmas. Suddenly, a loud smack could be heard from where Carter was standing. We don't have to wait for Josh, he declared, slamming a folder stuffed with paper onto the table. First, we need to fill Ronald in on the details. The entire group crowded around the table as Carter opened the folder. He pointed to the first page where he had scrawled all the details that were known. Ronald, this is what we have gathered so far. If anyone knows anything else, I suggest you tell me as we speak, because we need to ensure we're on the same page, Carter informed, a stern expression plastered on his face. Wow, Carter. You're really into this, Yuta commented, sheepishly rubbing his hand behind his neck. Carter looked up at Yuta and scoffed. Just like I'm into talking, huh? He curtly remarked. Yuta widened his eyes when the realization struck him. Flustered and embarrassed, he looked down at his feet, hiding his reddening cheeks with his black hair. He played with the sleeves of his sweater, as the feeling of anguish and regret caused him to tremble. Yuta tried to open his mouth and apologize, but his heavy heart prevented him. During this, Ronald had picked up the piece of paper and read over it. The numbers below the symbol form a date. He asked, interrupting the awkward scene between Yuta and Carter. Carter nodded. It translates to September 3, 1946. The only significant thing about that day is the fact that it was the first day of school. Although it could be anything. He explained, pushing his silver hair away from his eyes with his hands. Do you have any idea as to what this could possibly mean? You're new and it would be plenty helpful to hear someone else's opinion, Carter asked Ronald. Ronald shrugged. Not a clue, he bluntly responded, shaking his head. Before Carter could sigh dramatically and act like everyone was stupid except him, Olivia huffed from the other side of the table, grabbing the group's attention. Why, I just want to clarify. Everyone standing in this room has the mark, right? Except Yuta, of course, she asked, giving Yuta a suspicious side eye. Yes. Josh doesn't either, but he's not in the room currently, Carter responded. Olivia rolled her eyes. Didn't Josh tell you? He has the mark too, she said, in an oblivious manner. The entire group stared at Olivia with shock. What? Carter shouted, slamming his fists on the table. He stared at Olivia with wide eyes that were as intimidating as a wolf. Suddenly, the tension in the room increased. Ronald also had a dramatic reaction. Him too. Since when? He exclaimed, leaning forward and staring intently at Olivia, desperate for an explanation. Olivia recoiled, slightly taken aback by their abrupt reactions. I thought you already knew, she said faintly, weakly defending herself. Carter groaned and shook his head. No, you didn't tell us, Olivia. That was your job. He disputed angrily, rage pulsing through his veins. Yuta nervously darted his eyes back and forth between the two, frightened by the feud occurring in front of him. Is this what Carter meant earlier? About sorting things out between each other before trying to solve a mystery together. Olivia placed both hands on her hips, suddenly regaining her stance. Excuse me. First of all, you just broke another rule. Don't ever yell at me. Second of all, I don't even know your name. Cameron. Casper. Third of all, it was never my job. It was Josh's. He was probably going to tell you during this meeting, Olivia protested, an immense amount of sass present in her tone. Carter bared his teeth at Olivia like a dog. I told you to inform me about anything important. This is important, calm down. Enough bickering. You're all overreacting, Jessica suddenly stepped in, flailing her hands in between them to catch their attention. Think about it. It's a good thing Josh has the mark too. That way we can keep this secret between fewer outsiders, Jessica continued with reason in her voice. After this, the heat and tension between the group died down, but it slowly happened. Carter nodded his head and exhaled. Olivia, is there any chance Josh told you about how he got the mark? He asked through gritted teeth, trying his best to suppress his temper by not looking directly at Olivia's face. Olivia pondered for a moment, thinking deeply about her recent confrontation with Josh. Yuta could feel Carter's body tense from beside him, knowing entirely well how much the boy despised it when people take too long to answer his questions. Yuta placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder, hoping it was the least he could do to compensate for his earlier remark. Carter allowed Yuta to place his hand on his shoulder but didn't look his way. After another minute of thinking, Olivia jolted her head, remembering. Yeah, Josh told me that during football practice Ronald chucked the ball at him. Then he became unconscious for a couple of minutes. Olivia began being useful to the group for once. He told me he saw cockeyed visions and then he noticed the mark afterwards, Olivia explained, shrugging. Interesting. Josh also experienced something abnormal before attaining the mark. That confirms my theory, Carter said, snatching the piece of paper from Ronald's grasp and quickly jotting that information down on it. Jessica peered at the paper. What theory? She asked, an eyebrow arched in confusion. Why, ever since you and Olivia informed us about the delusions you were having, I pondered about it. I realized that perhaps there is a connection between all of our cases. We each experienced the thing and afterwards, the mark appeared on our mitts, Carter explained. He glanced at Ronald. It's the same with you, correct? You experienced something strange, and then you noticed the mark. Ronald nodded his head. Yes, that's exactly what happened. Jessica gazed at Carter in awe. Wow, I didn't even realize that, she stated, blinking her blonde lashes rapidly. Carter grinned and shrugged, wanting to appear unfazed about the realization. Yuta knew that inside, Carter was feeling extremely egotistic about his achievement. That's great, Carter. Yuta interjected, genuinely wanting to redeem himself to Carter. However, Yuta was still feeling slightly nervous about speaking up and apologizing formally. He wondered if Carter thought of him as a heavy piece of baggage that he was forced to carry around with him. Carter ignored Yuta's statement and shuffled the papers in front of him, placing them in order. That response only furthered the doubts in Yuta's mind and pinched his heart in a way that made him grimace. I suppose this is how he felt when I said that. He sighed and played with the strings of his black sweater, something he often did when he was uncomfortable. Olivia clicked her tongue, wanting the attention back on her. What do you suppose we do with this information? It doesn't bring us any step closer to finding out the cause of the thing. Olivia stated, twirling a lock of her dark hair around her finger. Jessica glanced at Olivia. True, but it helps us understand the patterns of the thing, and why the mark appeared in the first place, Jessica defended factually, which received a dirty glare from Olivia. Suddenly, the door behind them burst open and an eruption of fresh air filled the obscure classroom. Everyone turned around and saw Josh rushing in. The gym bag strapped around his shoulder jumped up and down as he dashed into the room. Sweat dripped down his forehead, suggesting he had been running laps outside. The boy panted heavily as he approached the table, his eyes wide. "I need to tell you something," he exclaimed out of breath. "Josh," Olivia shouted ecstatically. She outstretched her arms and ran towards her boyfriend, puckering her lips and preparing for a kiss. Before she could embrace Josh, he pushed her away carelessly. Yuta winced as the frail girl tumbled to the ground after Josh's hard shove. Carter crossed his arms and stared at Josh sternly. "Real swell of you to show up now," he scoffed sarcastically. "Listen," Josh began, his chest heaving as he placed a hand on his damp light brown hair. "There's something important I realized the other day. I told Olivia this, but I bet you realize plenty of important things." Ronald interrupted before Josh could finish his sentence. Ronald stepped forward and approached Josh, his arms crossed as he stared furiously at Josh's face. Yuta wondered how Ronald could remain this calm as he spoke out against Josh. Josh was like a wild force, and if someone disturbed it even with a simple touch, they would be mercilessly swept away by a fierce gush of wind. Josh slowly spun around, still panting. He stared straight into Ronald's dark brown eyes and glared darkly at him. Yuta gulped, watching as the two boys stared daggers into each other's eyes. He felt a strong tension in the room that wasn't there earlier, or even when Ronald and Josh quarreled before first period class. He wondered what history the two boys had, and what made them detest each other so much. "It was quite bold of you to show your face here today. Especially after what you did," Ronald spoke, disdain present in his tone. Josh scoffed, forgetting about the important piece of information he so desperately wanted to tell the group a couple of seconds ago. "It was quite bold of you to show your face at practice today. Especially after what I did," Josh retaliated curtly. Ronald tilted his head, undaunted by his harsh comment. "Ah, so you admit that you were the one who bribed McGurdy into making you captain again for today's practice. You got to her before me because you knew that you didn't deserve it today," Ronald fired back ruthlessly. Josh gave Ronald a sinister grin. "Who said anything about bribing? I simply charmed her, that's all," Josh countered, laughing bitterly. From where he stood, Yuta could only see the side of that grin, yet it still frightened him and caused goosebumps to appear on his arms. Ronald gave Josh a disgusting look. "You jerk," he boorishly responded. Yuta's gaze switched over to Ronald, who gave Josh an equally malicious glare. Josh chuckled. Ruefully, "What? Are you still in the sticks about looking like a fat head in front of the coach?" Josh smugly stated, crossing his arms. "Think you're going to lose that scholarship?" he hissed, leaning close to Ronald's face and stung him right where it hurt. "Shut up," Yuta abruptly snapped, clenching his fists as anger and frustration boiled his blood. This caught everyone off guard, and they all turned to look at the usually quiet boy, bewilderment spreading across their faces. Yuta widened his flaming black eyes and stared at everyone in the room. Anger boiled deep in his system as hot as lava. It churned within, hungry for destruction, and Yuta instantly knew that it's too much for him to handle. The pressure of this raging sea of anger forced him to express thoughts that he suppressed for many long minutes during this suspenseful meeting. "I get it. We all hate each other," Yuta shouted again, although it was unnecessary now that he had their complete attention. Speaking wasn't a trouble for Yuta. He could easily talk publicly in class without being anxious about it since the teacher was usually the one specifically asking Yuta a question. However, it was difficult for Yuta to speak up on his own and share his own opinion with a group of people. He felt like a burden on everyone when he spoke or apologized. He felt that he annoyed his classmates when he mindlessly talked, so he kept to himself most of the time. He got that insecurity when his friends from his old school told him that. And his father. However, this time it was different. It's not that he wanted everyone to get along because he knew that would be impossible. He just wanted to solve this stupid mystery. Ever since he stepped into this room, he felt the tension increase minute by minute. Jessica hates Olivia. Ronald and Josh hate each other. Carter hates Olivia and Jessica. Olivia hates everyone except Josh and Jessica. Carter hates Yuta now. Yuta hated all of the hate. The fury burned inside his heart and gnawed at every crook and crevice of his mind, impossible to shake off. It reminded him of how much his father hated him. Let's just calm down, okay? Yuta screamed again, his eyebrows furrowed. He felt many judging eyes on him, and his heart beat rapidly against his chest. If what all of you were saying is true, that the experiences you had are real, then I want us to cooperate and get to the bottom of this. We can't waste time arguing. I heard how much it pained all of you. The shadow, the demon, the suffocating, the visions. I don't want you to get hurt anymore. Yuta shouted, his entire body trembling. His mouth moved on its own, spilling all the passionate details Yuta trapped in his mind. It makes me feel guilty that I'm not going through what you're going through. So please let me help in the way that I can. Let's put an end to all this pain and hatred together. Yuta finished, panting as he finally let go of the breath he was holding in. There was a moment of silence between the group. Everyone froze and no one spoke a word. They just absorbed Yuta's words and let it sink in. Yuta looked at Carter, who was staring at Yuta with sad but understanding eyes. Yuta shifted his gaze towards Jessica, who gave him a remorseful look. Josh and Ronald stopped glaring at each other and Olivia had an emotional expression on her face for once. Yuta felt the tension in the room slowly disintegrate, completely this time. As the atmosphere converted to calm and quiet, Yuta relaxed his tensed nerves. Yuta spoke, breaking the silence. I hope you understand now, he mumbled, slightly embarrassed as he replayed the outburst in his head multiple times. Carter exhaled and looked at Yuta. He gave the boy a timid smile, telling him that he finally forgave him. Yuta is right. We don't have to be in cahoots during school or outside of school. But we should at least try and cooperate during our meetings after school, he said, giving Yuta a reassuring nod. Yeah. I suppose we should get back to work, Yuta suggested, as relief washed over his tense body. Josh, did you have something important that you wanted to tell us? Yuta softly asked, turning to look at Josh. Josh inhaled deeply and nodded his head. Yeah. He quietly spoke. Told Olivia this the other day, but I think I know what the thing is, he began, forcing himself to forget his feud with Ronald. Paranormal activity. That's what's happening to us. It's just my theory, but it's the only reasonable explanation I can't think of. Jessica cocked her head to the side. Paranormal activity. That sounds like something from a horror movie, she pointed out skeptically. Josh nodded his head. Yeah, that's where I got the idea from. The uninvited Black Friday Blithe Spirit, he explained, listing movies that recently premiered centered around that topic. Carter looked around the group after moments of pondering. I suppose that makes sense. Paranormal activity is a purported phenomenon that science can't explain. That matches the situation we're currently facing, he stated. At least we have a label for the thing. Yuta piped in, shrugging off his internal guilt. That day I unleashed the white light and was being chased by the phantom. All those scenarios I thought of in my head match exactly what my friends are going through. Should I tell them? But won't they suspect me? Ronald bit his lip, deep in thought. So, we know that the paranormal activity occurs and then the mark appears. We also know that the mark has the date of the first day of school. Now what do we make of this? He inquired. I'm still confused, Josh said, raising his hand. Yuta doesn't have the mark, and we know that having the mark correlates with experiencing paranormal activity. Yuta, are you sure you have not experienced anything strange? Anything like we experienced? I'm just asking to clarify. Yuta gulped, understanding Josh's underlying intentions with that question. Josh wasn't confused at all, he wanted to point fingers at him. I can assure you that I do not have the mark nor have I experienced anything out of the ordinary. I swear, he said, guilt piling up in his stomach as he lied. He assured himself that it was half true, he had no mark engraved on his palm. However, that could be because he was the one who did something paranormal, not because he experienced something paranormal. It's not like I did it intentionally, he thought, regretting speaking those foreign words that day. I have barely a clue about the extent of the havoc it caused. I have barely a clue about my abnormality. If I tell them, it will only worsen things. Carter placed both of his hands on the table in front of him, his serious expression unchanging. Let's collect our thoughts for a second and talk about what we do know. Where did this paranormal activity occur for each of us? He queried, looking around the group. For me, it happened twice in the gym where the pool is. The first time it happened was in the locker room, and the second time was in the pool while I was swimming. Oh, it also happened to me twice. Firstly, when I was in the detention closet, Olivia said, perking up. The second time happened when I was home. It was something similar to a shadow grabbing my wrists. It happened to you twice. So far, the paranormal activity occurred to me once, in the girls' washroom, Jessica mentioned, turning to look at Carter. Carter nodded his head, absorbing the information that was already known. What about you, Josh and Ronald? He asked the boys standing to his left. I saw the visions in the middle of practice, out on the football field, Josh answered candidly. Ronald furrowed his eyebrows, recalling the events of the past few days. So far, I only experienced it while I was walking home. It ended when I got to my room and my father walked in, Ronald explained. Carter bit his lip, sorting the information in his head. What do you suppose the correlation is between all of our experiences? Besides the mark, of course, he asked, hoping that a suggestion would spark a revelation in their mind. Jessica suddenly gasped after a moment's thought. All of us either experienced it at school or at home. That must mean something, she commented, pointing out the obvious. Yuta shook his head, feeling that something was missing within that proposal. No, that still doesn't make sense. It doesn't explain why some of you experienced it at home or at school. Maybe each of us isn't experiencing the same paranormal activity. Maybe it's something entirely different for the individual person, Carter theorized, trying to broaden the spectrum of ideas. That also doesn't make sense. You all have to be experiencing the same thing because you each have the same mark. Plus, it could be possible that the paranormal thing you experience can take on different forms, which explains why each of you experienced something different in a different place, Yuta pointed out. After a second of deep thinking, a light bulb turned on in his brain. Wait, Ronald, what exactly happened that kickstarted your paranormal experience? Jessica was telling me about what happened to her in the washroom that day. Then she showed me her mark. Suddenly my head began aching and I started experiencing visions for the rest of the walk home. He simply explained, shrugging. Yuta leaned forward, adrenaline pumping in his veins as he felt himself inching closer towards the answer. Where were you when this initiation happened? He inquired further. Ronald bit his lip, digging deep in his mind to recall the blurry details from the event. Oh, I think we were in front of the school gates, jeepers. That's it. Yuta interjected, suddenly jumping. Everyone turned to look at him, desperate for an explanation. Every single one of you first experienced the paranormal activity at school. Then your mark appeared, he explained, triumph washing over him. After that, some of you experienced it at home, but that's only because you're marked now, he added, his eyes beaming with realization. Carter widened his eyes. Are you suggesting that the paranormal activity that's occurring to us is because we were at school? He questioned. Yuta nodded his head. An elated grin plastered across his face. You're on the nose. That also explains the date. You all experienced the paranormal activity on the first day of school or after. So, are you suggesting that this school is haunted or something? Josh inquired, unsure of what to make of the situation. Yuta shrugged, out of breath from all the conversation. Possibly. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Wait, does that mean this stupid tattoo would have never appeared on my mitts if I simply did not go to this school? Olivia stupidly asked, dumbfounded by all the dumps of information. Perhaps it's not the school, Carter cut in. Perhaps it's someone inside this school, he suggested. At the mention of this comment, everyone turned to look at Yuta. Before Yuta could question this and combat their suspicions, the door behind them creaked open. The group of students turned around, and to their surprise, Mr. Stevenson walked into the room. They silently watched their teacher juggling a bitten apple between his hands, as his tousled auburn hair flopped up and down with each bubbly step. A gasp escaped his lips when he noticed the group of students in his classroom, who were not supposed to be there. What are you children doing here, unsupervised? He asked, a confused expression on his face, yet a friendly and polite tone remained in his tone. This is quite an unlikely group, he added, lightheartedly. The group exchanged nervous glances between each other, waiting for the other to speak up. In the end, no one spoke up. Yuta placed his sweaty palms deep in the pockets of his black trousers, as panic swelled up inside him. What's going to happen if he finds out? He couldn't help but wonder. Mr. Stevenson tilted his head and gave the students a perplexed look. Is this some sort of after-school club? If so, where's the teacher that's supposed to be on supervision? And why wasn't I informed of this since it seems to be occurring in my classroom? He inquired suspiciously, walking closer towards the group. As Mr. Stevenson approached them, Carter quickly shut the file of information he brought with him and discreetly hid it behind his back. Olivia was the one who spoke up first, after pushing Jessica aside and walking towards Mr. Stevenson, hoping to grab his attention. Why? The teacher that was on supervision recently left to go to the powder room, Olivia said, lying through her pearl-white teeth. Mr. Stevenson still had a doubtful look on his face. Oh, and may I ask which teacher this is? He questioned, crossing his arms and taking a bite out of his juicy red apple. Olivia twiddled her fingers, something Yuta noticed she often did when nervous or under tense situations. Mrs. Briggs. She randomly said, unable to think of anyone else. Mrs. Briggs. She doesn't strike me as the type to be involved with student activities, Mr. Stevenson correctly pointed out, the sound of his apple crunching between his teeth filling the silent room. Why, you know Mrs. Briggs. I recall her saying something about being forced to monitor at least one club, Olivia explained, building on her false story. Anyways, she's so rude and does a terrible job helping us out, Olivia pointlessly added, chuckling nervously. Mr. Stevenson flashed a grin, laughing with Olivia. That's true. Mr. Stevenson turned to look at the rest of the students. So what exactly is this club? It's my job as your teacher to help you out when needed. Maybe I can step in for Mrs. Briggs for the time being, Mr. Stevenson suggested, placing himself at the head of the table by squeezing in between Carter and Yuta. Olivia's eyebrows furrowed with worry and her brown eyes skittishly darted around the room, desperate for help. Thankfully, Josh stepped in. Of course, Mr. Stevenson, he exclaimed in an unnaturally giddy voice. This is, a leadership club, Josh blurted, getting that idea from seemingly nowhere. Carter sighed and placed a palm over his forehead, and Yuta could sense his frustration, even from where he was standing. Oh, a leadership club. That's splendid, Mr. Stevenson said, perking up. Is this a new club? I seem to never have heard of it before. Josh nodded his head. Yeah, this club was Yuta's idea, Josh said, pointing at Yuta. There was a great leadership club at his old school, so when he realized there was no leadership club at this school, he decided to start one himself. Josh continued, spitting aimless lies. Yuta widened his eyes as the group shifted their focus on him. He sighed, desperately wanting the floor beneath him to open up and swallow him. He was not a fan of lying, especially to the teacher he looked up to the most. Mr. Stevenson's eyebrows shot up, impressed. He turned to look at Yuta, as he shrunk in his looming presence. Really? That's amazing, Yuta. So, were you the one who chose the members? Mr. Stevenson asked. With the spotlight suddenly on him, Yuta had no idea what to lie about. He stuttered for a few seconds, rubbing the excess fabric of his sweater between his thumbs anxiously. Carter gave Yuta a reassuring look, urging him to continue. Yeah, Yuta sputtered, looking up at Mr. Stevenson's kind emerald eyes. Those eyes lit up the darkroom, and suddenly calmness washed over Yuta, easing his fumbling mind. Yeah, I liked the club at my old school. I wanted to start something similar here since I made lots of friends through that club, Yuta said, his lying voice soft and steady. I think this is an excellent idea, Mr. Stevenson said, placing a warm hand on Yuta's shoulder. The group sighed with relief in unison, having jumped the most difficult hurdle. If you don't mind, I would like to share my expertise in leadership. I was once in high school too, you know, Mr. Stevenson said, gazing around the students with a benevolent smile. Carter looked up and beamed at Mr. Stevenson. Yes, please share, he said ecstatically. After their interrupted meeting was over, the 6 students slowly filed out of the classroom. Carter and Josh were the first ones out the door, as Carter dragged the boy by his shoulder. Leadership club. What the hell were you thinking? Carter angrily whispered, clutching his folder tightly. Josh shrugged, swatting Carter's hand off his shoulder. It worked out in the end. Anyways, I got that idea from the fact that Ronald needs to improve his leadership, Josh jeeringly taunted, glancing over his shoulder and grinning at the boy trailing behind him. This remark seemed to irritate Ronald, as Ronald shot a scornful look at his teammate. Behind Ronald, Jessica and Olivia trudged behind the group as they walked out the door. Jessica rolled her eyes as Olivia gazed at their teacher lovingly. The last one to leave was Utah. He picked up his black backpack from the floor and swung it over his shoulder. Before he walked out the door, Utah turned around and gave his teacher a timid smile. Thanks, Mr. Stevenson, Utah said, innocently waving him goodbye. Mr. Stevenson nodded. No problem, Utah, he said, giving the boy a kind smile. If there's anything you need to talk about, just now that I'm always here, Mr. Stevenson said, a glint of understanding flickering in his eyes. Utah was slightly surprised to hear that. He wondered whether Mr. Stevenson could sense the darkness that was engulfing the boy. He quickly brushed that unsettling thought away, feeling more happier about the fact that he had never heard words that kind from one of his teachers. He nodded his head, grinning. Utah genuinely felt safe with Mr. Stevenson, and he could tell why all the students at Willsden love him. His warm embrace, encouraging words, and laid-back personality was all Utah ever wanted in a teacher. Or even a father. Yeah, sure. Utah excitedly replied, beaming from head to toe. As Utah turned to leave, Mr. Stevenson took the last bite from his apple, the crunching noise filling the otherwise ghost-quiet classroom. A smile danced on his face as he watched the boy walk away.